Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might seem strange at first. What if the man in the red suit you grew up with, the one sliding down chimneys with a sack of toys, started as something completely different? Not at the North Pole, not in a workshop, but in a sun-baked Mediterranean city, where a young bishop walked dusty streets and quietly changed lives with acts of generosity that would echo across 17 centuries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of Santa Claus is not what you think it is. It's not a fairy tale that sprang fully formed from the imagination of a children's book author. It's not a marketing invention, though marketing certainly got its hands on it. It's a slow accretion of history, faith, folklore, commerce, and human longing, layered across 17 centuries like geological strata. At its foundation lies a real man, Nicholas of Myra, who lived and died in the 4th century, thousands of miles from the North Pole, in a world so foreign to our own that it might as well be another planet. Tonight, we're going to trace how a pious bishop known for secret charity became the jolly, rotund gift giver of modern Christmas. We'll follow this story through Byzantine churches, medieval festivals, Dutch ships crossing the Atlantic, American poems and illustrations, department store promotions, and finally, global commercialization that would have shocked the original Nicholas down to his sandals. This isn't just about Santa Claus. It's about how stories evolve, how cultures blend, how commerce shapes tradition, and how human beings across centuries have needed symbols of generosity and magic, especially in the darkest time of the year. For those of you who remember simpler Christmases, when a single orange in a stocking felt like treasure, when department store windows held genuine wonder, when gifts were fewer but somehow meant more, this story will show you how we got from there to here. But we start small. We start simple. We start with a man who simply wanted to help people in need quietly, without fanfare. A man who would be astonished to know that 1700 years later, billions of people would know his name, even if they know almost nothing about who he actually was. Let's begin. The real Saint Nicholas, a bishop in a dangerous time. Nicholas was born around 270 CE in Patara, a coastal town in what is now southern Turkey, then part of the Roman Empire in the region known as Lycia. His world was one of Mediterranean trade, Greek culture under Roman rule, and an increasingly assertive Christian church that was still, in his youth, technically illegal and occasionally persecuted. The details of his early life are sketchy, buried under centuries of legend. According to tradition, he was born into a wealthy Christian family. His parents died when he was young, possibly in one of the plagues that swept through the Roman Empire with distressing regularity, and he inherited their substantial fortune. This was a young man with options. He could have lived comfortably as a wealthy landowner, invested in shipping, become a merchant, enjoyed the good life that Mediterranean prosperity could offer in the late Roman period. Instead, he chose something else. He gave it away. Not all at once, not ostentatiously, but quietly, methodically, to people who needed it. Widows who couldn't pay debts, families who couldn't afford dowries for their daughters, a serious problem in a society where an unmarried daughter could mean destitution. Sailors who'd lost everything in shipwrecks. The poor who were one bad harvest away from starvation. This pattern of secret charity would become the foundation of everything that followed. Nicholas didn't trumpet his generosity. He didn't seek recognition. In fact, according to the stories that grew up around him, he went out of his way to give anonymously, often at night, sometimes throwing bags of coins through windows or leaving them on doorsteps. For those of you who came of age during the Depression, this kind of quiet generosity won't seem strange. You knew neighbors who helped each other without making a show of it. A bag of vegetables left on a porch. A few dollars slipped into a pocket. Help that arrived without fanfare because people understood that dignity mattered as much as the help itself. Nicholas understood this in the 4th century. He eventually became Bishop of Myra, the most important Christian leader in the region. This wasn't a ceremonial position. A bishop in the early church was administrator, judge, advocate, and spiritual leader all rolled into one. He settled disputes, managed church property, cared for the poor, and represented his community to Roman authorities who were often suspicious of this strange new religion. The year 325 CE found Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea, one of the most important gatherings in Christian history. Emperor Constantine had called together bishops from across the empire to settle theological disputes that were threatening to tear the church apart. Nicholas was there, one voice among hundreds, debating the nature of Christ, the structure of church authority, the relationship between Christianity and the Roman state. Legend says he got so worked up during these debates that he punched another bishop in the face. Allegedly struck Arius, whose theological views Nicholas found heretical, right there in the council chamber. Historical accuracy of this story, questionable at best, but it shows how later generations imagined Nicholas, passionate, uncompromising, willing to throw a punch for what he believed. Not exactly the jolly gift giver of modern imagination. Nicholas died on December 6, 343 CE, according to tradition. He was buried in his cathedral in Myra, and almost immediately, strange stories began to circulate. The tomb reportedly produced a fragrant liquid that was said to have healing properties. Pilgrims began visiting. Miracle stories multiplied. Within a generation or two, Nicholas wasn't just a former bishop. He was Saint Nicholas, patron saint of sailors, children, merchants, the falsely accused, and pretty much anyone who needed divine intervention. His reputation spread through the Byzantine Empire like ripples in a pond. Churches were dedicated to him. His feast day on December 6 became important in the liturgical calendar. Stories about his generosity grew more elaborate with each retelling. The historical Nicholas, pious, generous, probably stern, was already being transformed into something larger, something more mythic. But the real transformation was still centuries away. The veneration spreads. Byzantine Nicholas. The Byzantine Empire, what we might call the Eastern Roman Empire, though they just called themselves Romans, became the engine of Nicholas's spreading fame. Constantinople, the great capital on the Bosphorus, was the richest, most powerful city in Europe. It was also intensely religious, with churches and monasteries scattered throughout its streets, holy relics treasured like gold, and saints venerated with fervor that bordered on obsession. Nicholas fit perfectly into this culture. Here was a saint with impeccable credentials, orthodox theology, charitable works, miracle stories, and convenient geographical proximity. His tomb in Myra was reachable by ship, and Byzantine merchants and sailors frequented those waters. They brought back stories, relics, and devotion. Churches dedicated to Saint Nicholas began appearing across the Byzantine world. Not just a few, hundreds. In Constantinople alone, there were dozens of churches bearing his name. Sailors leaving port would stop at a Nicholas chapel to pray for safe passage. Merchants would offer thanks at Nicholas shrines when business went well. The stories about Nicholas evolved in the telling. One popular tale involved three daughters whose father couldn't afford dowries. Without dowries, they faced grim futures. Prostitution was often the only option for poor unmarried women in the ancient world. Nicholas supposedly threw bags of gold through their window on 3 successive nights, providing the dowries and saving them from degradation. In some versions, he threw the gold down the chimney, and it landed in stockings hung to dry by the fire. Sound familiar? Another story had him rescuing 3 students who'd been murdered and pickled in a barrel by an evil innkeeper. Nicholas not only discovered the crime, but actually resurrected the boys. Grim stuff. Medieval people had a higher tolerance for dark fairy tales than we might expect. But the most enduring stories involved sailors. Nicholas became the patron saint of seafarers, which made perfect sense given that Myra was a port city, and Nicholas had reportedly calmed storms, rescued ships, and saved sailors from drowning. In a world where sea travel was dangerous and unpredictable, where storms could send entire ships to the bottom in minutes, having a saint who specialized in maritime rescue was valuable spiritual insurance. If you served in the Navy, or knew men who did, you understand the impulse. When you're on a ship in heavy seas, when the weather turns and you can't see more than a few feet in any direction, when everything depends on wood and rope, and the skill of men who are just as scared as you are, well, having someone to pray to feels less like superstition and more like basic common sense. The Byzantine veneration of Nicholas reached its peak in the 10th and 11th centuries. By then, his cult had spread north into Russia, where he became one of the most important saints in the Orthodox tradition. Russian churches dedicated to Nicholas numbered in the thousands. Icons of his stern, bearded face decorated countless homes. His feast day was celebrated with special fervor in the frozen north, where his association with winter and gift-giving would later seem almost inevitable. But Nicholas was still firmly a saint, a religious figure, part of church liturgy and Orthodox devotion. The transformation into Santa Claus, secular, commercial, child-centered, required a different set of influences. It required Northern European paganism, Dutch colonial trade, and eventually American commercial creativity. That transformation was coming, but it would take another few centuries to complete. The Germanic influence, Odin and the Wild Hunt. While Nicholas's cult spread through the Christian, Byzantine, and Russian world, something else was happening in Northern Europe. The Germanic peoples, tribes and kingdoms scattered across what would become Germany, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and England, had their own winter traditions, their own gift-giving figures, their own celebrations during the darkest time of year. Before Christianity arrived in full force in these northern lands, before missionaries convinced people that their old gods were demons and their sacred groves should be chopped down, the Germanic peoples celebrated Yule. This was more than just a midwinter festival. It was a time when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, when the dead walked, when supernatural forces moved through the winter darkness. And at the center of Yule rode Odin. Odin, the All-Father, wanderer and wisdom seeker, god of war and poetry, death and magic. During Yule, he was said to lead the wild hunt, a spectral procession of gods, spirits, and the dead who rode through the sky on winter nights. This wasn't a cheerful parade. The wild hunt was dangerous. You didn't want to be caught outside when it passed. People left offerings to appease the riders, hoping they'd move on without causing harm. But Odin was also, in some traditions, a gift giver. He rewarded those who left offerings for him and his horse. In some versions of Germanic tradition, children would leave boots filled with hay and carrots for Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed, and would find gifts left in exchange by mourning. 8 legs, 8 reindeer. You see where this is going. Now, before we get too carried away drawing straight lines between Odin and Santa Claus, let's be clear. The historical connections are complicated, debated, and probably not as direct as some enthusiasts would have you believe. But the cultural similarities are striking. An ancient, bearded figure associated with winter, flying through the sky, visiting homes, rewarding children who left offerings, accompanied by supernatural animals. When Christianity spread through Germanic lands, it didn't simply erase these traditions. That's not how conversion usually worked. Instead, missionaries were smart enough to adapt, to blend, to let old traditions continue in slightly Christianized forms. Yule became Christmas. Odin's gift-giving became associated with Saint Nicholas. The Wild Hunt became a Christian parable about the dangers of sin. This process, scholars call it syncretism, the blending of different belief systems, happened across centuries. It wasn't planned, wasn't organized. It was organic, messy, the way culture actually changes when real people negotiate between old traditions and new beliefs. By the Middle Ages, across Germanic Europe, December 6, St. Nicholas's feast day, had become associated with gift-giving to children. Nicholas had become a bishop figure who visited homes, asked children if they'd been good, and left presents for those who passed the test. But he often came accompanied by darker figures, punishment companions who threatened naughty children. This is where things get delightfully weird. Krampus and the naughty list, Europe's punishment figures. In the Alpine regions, what's now Austria, Bavaria, northern Italy, St. Nicholas came accompanied by Krampus. This was a horned, demonic figure covered in dark hair, chains rattling, tongue lolling. While Nicholas rewarded good children, Krampus threatened the bad ones. He carried chains and birch switches. In the most extreme versions of the story, he carried a basket on his back to cart away naughty children and drown them, eat them, or drag them to hell. Cheerful stuff for the holiday season. In the Netherlands and Flanders, Nicholas's companion was Zwart Piet, Black Peter. In some German regions, it was Belsnickel or Necked Ruprecht. In France, Pier Fouettard, Father Whipper. Each region had its own version, but the pattern was consistent. One benevolent gift-giver paired with one threatening punisher. This reflected a particular medieval approach to child-rearing that might seem harsh to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense in a world where survival required obedience, where a child's disobedience could have serious consequences, where religious and social order were maintained through fear as much as love. For those of you who grew up when corporal punishment was simply called discipline, when teachers paddled students and parents didn't think twice about a belt, this probably doesn't seem as shocking as it would to younger generations. You knew that misbehavior had consequences, that authority figures meant what they said, that order required the credible threat of punishment. The medieval Christmas reflected this worldview. Nicholas brought gifts, yes, but his visit was also a reckoning, a judgment, an accounting of behavior. Had you been good, said your prayers, obeyed your parents, learned your lessons? If yes, rewards. If no, punishment, or at least the threat of it. This dual-natured Christmas visitor would eventually be sanitized, softened, made entirely benevolent. Santa Claus would keep the gift-giving and lose the punishment. The naughty list would become toothless, a joke, because Western parenting was moving away from fear-based discipline toward positive reinforcement. But in medieval and early modern Europe, the threat was real, and children understood that Nicholas's visit could go either way. These traditions varied wildly across Europe. In Spain, It wasn't Nicholas but the three wise men who brought gifts on January 6, Epiphany. In parts of Italy, a witch named Befana filled stockings. In Scandinavia, Christmas goats and tomt, gnome-like creatures, delivered presents. England had Father Christmas, who was more about feasting and goodwill than specifically bringing gifts to children. The point is that there was no single, unified Christmas tradition. Europe was a patchwork of local customs, regional variations, each with its own history and logic. The standardized, commercialized Christmas we know today, the one where everyone expects the same basic narrative, didn't exist. That standardization would be largely an American innovation. But it required one more ingredient: the Dutch. Sinterklaas arrives, the Dutch connection. In the Netherlands, Saint Nicholas, Sinterklaas in Dutch, became something unique. The Dutch took the Byzantine bishop and transformed him into a figure that would be recognizable to modern eyes as a clear ancestor of Santa Claus. Dutch Sinterklaas arrived every year on December 5, the evening before St. Nicholas's feast day. But he didn't walk or appear magically. He arrived by steamboat from Spain, accompanied by helpers, carrying a big book that recorded every child's behavior for the year. This was theater, performance, communal celebration. The Dutch made Sinterklaas distinctly their own. He rode a white horse, not reindeer, not Odin's eight-legged Sleipnir, but an ordinary white horse that somehow managed to gallop across rooftops. Children left shoes by the fireplace filled with hay and carrots for the horse. In the morning, if they'd been good, the hay was gone and gifts had appeared. If they'd been bad, they found switches or coal, or in really extreme versions, warnings that they'd be carried back to Spain in Sinterklaas's bag. This was Nicholas fully domesticated, made part of family celebration, centered on children in a way that earlier traditions hadn't quite been. The Dutch were, by the 17th century, one of the most prosperous societies in Europe, with a robust merchant class that could afford to give children actual presents rather than just symbolic treats. Dutch childhood, at least for the non-poor, was becoming a time of protected innocence, play, education. Sinterklaas fit perfectly into this cultural moment. He rewarded learning, good behavior, religious devotion. He brought books, sweets, small toys. He was stern enough to maintain authority but benevolent enough to be loved. He was bishop but also friend, judge but also gift giver. And then the Dutch did something that would change everything. They sailed to the New World. In 1624, the Dutch established New Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. It was a commercial venture, a trading post for furs, a foothold in the lucrative Atlantic trade network. The settlers who came were Dutch and they brought Dutch customs with them, including Sinterklaas. For a few decades in this tiny Dutch colony surrounded by English settlements, Sinterklaas was celebrated. Children left shoes. Gifts appeared. The tradition continued exactly as it had in Amsterdam or Rotterdam. But in 1664, the English showed up with warships, and the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, sensibly surrendered without a fight. New Amsterdam became New York. The Dutch population remained, but English culture began to dominate. English language, English law, English customs. Sinterklaas might have disappeared entirely, just another casualty of cultural conquest. But he didn't. He went underground, persisted in Dutch-American families, waiting for his moment to resurface. That moment would come in the early 1800s, when a group of New York writers decided that their city needed cultural traditions of its own, something that wasn't just borrowed from England. They would reach back to New York's Dutch past and pull Sinterklaas into the American present. And in doing so, they would begin the final transformation that would turn a Byzantine bishop into Santa Claus. American innovation. Washington Irving's imagination. Washington Irving is best known for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, but his influence on Christmas might be his more lasting legacy. In 1809, he published A History of New York, a satirical mock history written under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker. It wasn't meant to be serious history. It was social commentary, humor, gentle mockery of New York's pretensions. But buried in this satire were descriptions of how the early Dutch settlers celebrated St. Nicholas. Irving painted a picture of jolly Dutch families gathering for Sinterklaas festivities, of St. Nicholas arriving in a wagon flying through the air, of gifts left in stockings. How much of this was real Dutch tradition and how much was Irving's invention is still debated. He certainly embellished. He romanticized. He created a myth of old Dutch New York that bore only passing resemblance to the actual historical record. But here's the thing about myths. Accuracy matters less than resonance. Irving's St. Nicholas captured something Americans wanted, even if they didn't know they wanted it yet. The book was a success. It went through multiple editions, was widely read, became part of how New Yorkers understood their own history. And St. Nicholas, Irving's version of him, entered the American imagination. But Irving didn't work alone. He was part of a whole movement of New York writers and artists who were trying to create American cultural traditions. One of his collaborators was a man named John Pintard, who founded the New York Historical Society. Pintard was obsessed with St. Nicholas, saw him as the perfect patron saint for New York, a link to the city's Dutch past. In 1810, Pintard commissioned a drawing of St. Nicholas for the Historical Society. The artist depicted Nicholas as a bishop with a long robe, arriving with gifts and switches. But there were also details that pointed forward. A stocking hung by the fireplace, children eagerly awaiting his arrival. This was still St. Nicholas, not Santa Claus. Still religious, still a bishop, still carrying switches for naughty children. The full transformation hadn't happened yet. That would require poetry. The Night Before Christmas, Clement Clarke Moore's immortal poem. In 1823, a poem appeared anonymously in a New York newspaper. It was titled, An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, though it would become known as The Night Before Christmas, or 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. The author, later revealed to be Clement Clarke Moore, a wealthy New York scholar and professor, probably never imagined that these verses would become the most influential piece of Christmas literature ever written in America. But they were. The poem did several things simultaneously. First, it domesticated St. Nicholas completely. This wasn't a stern bishop arriving to judge children. This was a jolly old elf, described with warmth and humor, non-threatening, purely benevolent. Second, it established specific imagery that hadn't existed before. The reindeer, 8 of them, all named. The sleigh flying through the air. Nicholas descending chimneys. The entire visit taking place at night while children slept. The emphasis on quiet, magic wonder. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. This was revolutionary. Nicholas was no longer regal, episcopal, distant. He was accessible, almost working class in his description. A peddler, covered in soot, carrying a pack like a tradesman. He was chubby and cheerful, with a round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. For those of you who remember when Christmas was simpler, when the whole season wasn't a months-long commercial frenzy, when a child's wonder at a single unexpected gift could light up a room, this poem captured something of that magic. It made Christmas intimate, family-centered, gentle. The poem spread. It was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It was recited at Christmas gatherings. It was memorized by children. It became, within a generation, simply part of American Christmas as if it had always existed. But there was still a visual problem. The poem described Saint Nicholas, but people needed to see him. Words were one thing, images were another. For that, America turned to one of its greatest illustrators. Thomas Nast's visual legacy, creating the modern image. Thomas Nast was a German immigrant who became America's most influential political cartoonist. His drawings helped bring down the corrupt Tweed Ring in New York. His illustrations defined how Americans visualized Uncle Sam, the Democratic donkey, and the Republican elephant. And beginning in the 1860s, he created the definitive visual image of Santa Claus. Nast's Santa Claus appeared in Harper's Weekly, the most widely circulated magazine of the era. Year after year, Christmas after Christmas, Nast drew Santa, and with each drawing he refined the image, added details, built the mythology. In Nast's hands, Santa acquired a red suit trimmed with white fur. He got a workshop at the North Pole. He got a throne where he sat checking his list. He got elves working for him. He got a Mrs. Claus. He got the whole infrastructure of Santa's operation that we now take for granted. Nast worked during the Civil War, and his early Santa illustrations carried patriotic themes. Santa visiting Union soldiers, Santa punishing Confederate traitors, Santa as a force for national unity and moral authority. This wasn't just holiday fluff. This was using the emerging Santa Claus mythology to serve larger cultural purposes. But after the war, Nast's Santa became less political and more universal. He became the Santa that children across America could recognize, the Santa that looked the same whether you lived in New York or California, whether you were rich or poor, immigrant or native-born. Those of you who grew up in the Depression and the years after World War II, you grew up with Nast's Santa. The department store Santas you saw, the Christmas cards your family received, the decorations in shop windows, all descended from Nast's illustrations. He standardized the image, made it reproducible, turned it into American visual culture. By the 1890s, Santa Claus was everywhere in American culture. Every year brought more Santa imagery, more Christmas cards, more decorations, more commercial tie-ins. The holiday was becoming big business, and Santa was the perfect spokesman for it. Which brings us to the question everyone asks: did Coca-Cola invent Santa Claus? The Coca-Cola myth, commercialization and truth. No, Coca-Cola did not invent Santa Claus. This myth persists, repeated every Christmas, but it's simply not true. What Coca-Cola did do, starting in 1931, was commission a series of advertisements featuring Santa Claus. The artist was Haddon Sundblom, and his paintings of Santa were gorgeous, warm, realistic, incredibly appealing. His Santa drank Coca-Cola while delivering presents, took a break in living rooms across America, always had a Coke nearby. These advertisements were everywhere: magazines, billboards, store displays. Coca-Cola's advertising budget was massive, and they pushed these Santa images relentlessly. For decades, every December, Americans saw Sundblom's Santa. But Santa already existed. Nast had established the visual image 60 years earlier. The red suit, the white beard, the round belly, all of that was in place long before Coca-Cola got involved. What Coca-Cola did was amplify, standardize, commercialize. They took the existing Santa and used advertising muscle to make their particular version ubiquitous. They didn't invent Santa Claus, but they absolutely helped nail down the modern image in the American consciousness. The commercialization of Christmas accelerated dramatically after World War II. For those of you who lived through this, you saw it happen. Christmas went from a primarily religious and family celebration to a massive commercial event. Retailers discovered that Christmas shopping could make or break their entire year. The Christmas season started earlier and earlier. Gift giving became more elaborate, more expensive, more expected. Santa Claus was the perfect mascot for all of this. He was associated with gifts, with abundance, with making wishes come true through material goods. Every store wanted a Santa. Every advertisement could use a Santa. Every product could be marketed as a perfect Christmas gift, endorsed by the jolly man himself. Department stores created elaborate Santa displays. Macy's in New York, Marshall Field's in Chicago, Gimbel's, all the major stores, they competed to have the most impressive Santa. Children waited in long lines to sit on Santa's lap, tell him what they wanted, have their picture taken. This became ritual, expectation, part of what Christmas meant. Those of you who took your own children or grandchildren to see department store Santas remember the mix of magic and commerce. The way the experience was both genuinely meaningful and obviously commercial. Kids believed, really believed, and that belief was powerful even as you paid for the photograph and walked past displays designed to encourage purchases. This was Santa fully transformed. No longer a saint. No longer even particularly connected to Christianity, despite appearing at Christmas. He'd become secular, commercial, universal, at least in American culture. And then he went global. Global Santa, export and adaptation. After World War II, American culture spread across the globe with unprecedented force. Hollywood movies, American music, Coca-Cola, blue jeans, fast food. American commercial culture became global culture. And Santa Claus came along for the ride. This wasn't entirely new. European traditions of Saint Nicholas and Father Christmas had spread with European colonialism. But the specifically American Santa, the NASC Coca-Cola Santa, the department store Santa, the North Pole Santa with flying reindeer, this version went global in the 1950s and 60s. Some countries resisted. Some tried to maintain their own gift-bringing figures. In parts of Europe, St. Nicholas on December 6 and the Christ Child on December 25 held their ground against the American interloper. In Russia and Orthodox countries, Father Frost continued his own traditions. In Latin America, the Three Kings maintained their importance. But American Santa had advantages. He was tied to advertising, which meant he had money behind him. He appeared in American movies and television shows, which were watched worldwide. He fit perfectly with expanding consumer capitalism, which was becoming the dominant economic system. Countries adapted Santa to their own contexts. In Japan, where Christianity was a tiny minority, Christmas became purely secular, a romantic holiday for couples, a time for elaborate commercial displays, an excuse for KFC chicken dinners thanks to brilliant marketing. Santa appeared everywhere, but divorced from any religious context whatsoever. In Australia, Santa arrived on surfboards because December is summer there. In tropical countries, he showed up in red suits despite the heat making no sense. In some places, he merged with existing gift-giving traditions, creating hybrid figures that were part Santa, part local custom. The spread of Santa Claus is a story of globalization, of how capitalism creates cultural homogeneity, of how local traditions either resist or adapt to dominant commercial culture. It's not a simple story of American imperialism, though that's part of it. It's also about what people wanted, The magic, the generosity, the excuse for celebration and gift-giving. For those of you who have watched America change over your lifetimes, who have seen immigration transform communities, who have watched local traditions fade and new ones emerge, the globalization of Santa is part of a larger pattern you've witnessed. The world has become more connected, more uniform in some ways, and Christmas has been part of that homogenization. But it's also sparked backlash. In some countries, there's been pushback against American Christmas, efforts to preserve local traditions, resistance to the commercialization that Santa represents. Some Christians have tried to put Christ back in Christmas, seeing Santa as a secular distraction from religious meaning. The tension between sacred and secular, between tradition and commerce, between local and global, all of this plays out in contemporary arguments about Christmas and Santa Claus. Santa in the modern era, evolution continues. Santa Claus continues to evolve. In recent decades, he's become more diverse. Black Santas, Latino Santas, Asian Santas appearing in advertising and department stores, acknowledging that gift-giving magic shouldn't be exclusively white. Some people embrace this, others resist it, seeing it as political correctness ruining tradition. He's become more environmentally conscious in some portrayals, worried about climate change affecting the North Pole, using renewable energy for the workshop. He's been updated with technology, tracking websites where children can watch Santa's journey on Christmas Eve, email addresses where they can send wish lists, video chat visits during pandemic lockdowns. The basic mythology keeps expanding. Movies and television shows add new details. How did Santa meet Mrs. Claus? How does he deliver presents in one night? Time zones, magic, don't think too hard. What happens when kids stop believing? How does the naughty and nice list actually work? For younger generations, Santa exists in tension. There's the moment when belief breaks, when kids figure out the truth, sometimes traumatically, sometimes with gentle realization. There are debates about whether lying to children about Santa is harmful or harmless fun. There are guilt-ridden parents trying to balance magic with truth, tradition with authenticity. But Santa persists. Even people who know he's not real participate in the mythology. Adults buy Santa presents for each other. Families maintain the rituals even after children have long since stopped believing. The tradition has become larger than belief, a cultural practice that continues regardless of literal faith in the mythology. Those of you who have watched children grow into adults, who have seen grandchildren learn the truth about Santa just as you watched your own children do the same, you understand this. Santa Claus is a beautiful lie that serves important purposes. It teaches generosity, creates wonder, provides a focus for family traditions, gives children something magical to believe in during the years when magic seems possible. The criticism of Santa Claus is also persistent. He's accused of commercializing Christmas, distracting from religious meaning, teaching children that happiness comes from material goods, creating unrealistic expectations, even perpetuating class divisions. Rich kids get expensive presents from Santa, while poor kids wonder why Santa loves them less. These criticisms aren't new, though they're perhaps more vocal now. But they coexist with continued embrace of the tradition. Christmas remains the biggest commercial holiday in Western culture, and Santa remains its central figure. The psychology of Santa, why we need this myth. So why does this myth persist? Why do rational adults invest so much energy maintaining a fiction for children who will eventually learn the truth anyway? Psychologists have studied this. The Santa Claus tradition serves several functions. It provides a framework for teaching generosity, Children learn to give as well as receive. It creates family, ritual, and bonding. It offers children a sense of magic and wonder during the years when imagination is most vivid. It provides a behavior incentive system, however toothless the naughty list threat actually is. But maybe more importantly, Santa Claus serves adult needs as much as children's. He allows parents to create magic, to be anonymous benefactors, to watch pure joy without taking credit for it. He connects generations. Grandparents remember the Santa of their childhood, parents create Santa for their children, and the tradition flows forward. Santa Claus is also a story about abundance and generosity in a world that often feels scarce and selfish. He gives without expectation of return. He knows everyone's needs. He works tirelessly for others' happiness. These are values we want to believe in, even if we know they don't exist in the real world quite this purely. For those who lived through the Depression and the wars, who knew genuine scarcity and rationing, the abundance of modern Christmas might seem excessive. But it also represents something you helped build, a prosperity that allows even working-class families to give their children gifts, to create magic, to spare them the hardship you knew. Santa Claus embodies that post-scarcity dream. He has unlimited resources. His workshop can make anything. Every child can receive gifts without anyone going without. It's fantasy economics, but it's a beautiful fantasy. The tradition also connects to deep human needs for ritual, for marked time, for seasonal celebration. December is dark, cold, the deadest time of year in northern climates where these traditions originated. Having something to celebrate, someone magical to anticipate, lights and warmth and gifts in the deepest winter. This serves psychological needs that go back millennia, far before Christianity, far before Saint Nicholas. The ancient pagans celebrated winter solstice for a reason. The return of light, the promise of spring, the need for community and warmth in the darkest time, these are human universals. Santa Claus, Christmas, all the winter holidays are modern expressions of very old needs. Santa Claus taps into all of this. He's the benevolent father figure, the magical provider, the watcher who sees all but judges with kindness, the night visitor who brings good things, the reward for being good, the incarnation of the better angels of human nature. We need these stories. Maybe especially in a cynical age when trust in institutions is low, when community seems fragmented, when generosity often seems naive. Maybe that's when we need Santa Claus most. Not as a real person, but as a symbol of what we aspire to be. The enduring icon, Santa's future. So where does Santa Claus go from here? The myth continues to evolve as it has for 17 centuries. Environmental concerns are being integrated into the mythology. Children's books and movies show Santa worried about melting ice caps at the North Pole, switching to renewable energy, making toys from sustainable materials. This reflects contemporary anxieties and values being folded into the tradition, just as every generation has done. Technology keeps changing how Santa operates. GPS tracking, email wish lists, video chat visits, even AI-powered Santa bots that can have conversations with children. The core mythology adapts to whatever technological reality exists. Diversity and representation continue to be negotiated. The question of what Santa looks like, who can play Santa, whether Santa is universal or culturally specific, these debates are ongoing and probably will never be fully resolved. But the fundamentals probably won't change much. Santa will remain the gift bringer, the Christmas icon, the secular symbol of the holiday season. He'll continue to be both beloved and criticized, both magical and commercial, both traditional and constantly evolving. For those of you who have watched this evolution over many decades, who remember simpler Christmases and see the elaborate productions of today, the changes might seem excessive. But the core remains: giving, generosity, creating joy for others, especially children. Your grandchildren's grandchildren will probably still have some version of Santa Claus, though what form he takes we can't predict. Maybe he'll be a hologram. Maybe he'll be an AI. Maybe he'll return to being something more like Saint Nicholas, more religious, less commercial. Or maybe he'll keep evolving in directions we can't imagine. The one constant has been change. From a 4th century bishop to a Dutch colonial tradition, to an American commercial icon, to a global phenomenon, every stage has been transformation. There's no reason to think transformation will stop now. Reflections: what Santa tells us about ourselves. In the end, the story of Santa Claus is a story about us, about what we value, what we aspire to, what we teach our children, what we choose to believe even when we know it isn't literally true. It's a story about how traditions evolve, how culture changes, how the past is constantly being rewritten to serve the present. The 4th century Nicholas couldn't have imagined becoming the modern Santa Claus. Each transformation along the way was responding to the needs and values of its time. It's also a story about the power of stories themselves. Santa Claus exists because we collectively agree to believe in him, to perform the rituals, to maintain the fiction. He has no power except what we give him, which makes him entirely our creation, a mirror of our collective imagination. Those who study folklore and mythology point out that Santa Claus is one of the few genuinely new myths created in the modern era. Most of our stories are ancient, recycled, updated versions of very old tales. But Santa, this particular configuration of bishop, pagan god, commercial mascot, and domestic magic, is relatively recent, cobbled together over the past few centuries. Yet he's incredibly successful as a myth. Billions of people know him. He's recognized globally. He influences behavior, inspires charity, creates joy. For a fictional character, he has remarkable real-world impact. This speaks to something important about human nature. We need figures of pure benevolence. We need stories of generosity without strings attached. We need magic and wonder, especially for children, but also for ourselves. We need rituals that mark time and create community. Santa Claus provides all of this. He's a benevolent lie that serves truth, the truth that generosity matters, that children deserve joy, that giving is better than receiving, that we should strive to be good even when no one's watching. For those of you who grew up when life was harder, when survival wasn't guaranteed, when every day was work and worry, maybe you understand especially well why we create figures like Santa Claus. He represents a world where needs are met, where effort is rewarded, where goodness is recognized and celebrated. The world isn't actually like that. You know this from lived experience. Hard work doesn't always pay off. Good people suffer. Bad people prosper. Life isn't fair. But Santa Claus offers a counter-narrative. In Santa's world, goodness is rewarded. Needs are met. Joy is freely given. It's not true, but it's a truth we want to believe, at least for children, at least for one night a year. And maybe that's enough. Maybe having one night when we act as if the world works the way it should, generous, just magical. Maybe that's valuable even if the other 364 days tell a different story. Conclusion: the gift that keeps giving. Tonight we've traced Santa Claus from a 4th century bishop in Myra to a global commercial icon. We've watched him evolve through Byzantine veneration, Germanic mythology, Dutch colonial tradition, American literary imagination, commercial illustration, and global marketing. At every stage, Santa Claus has been what people needed him to be: a miracle worker for desperate believers, a gift giver for prosperous merchants, a symbol of Dutch identity for colonists, an American original for a young nation, a commercial mascot for expanding capitalism, a universal symbol of Christmas for a globalized world. He's not one thing. He's never been one thing. He's a palimpsest, layers of meaning and tradition written over each other across 17 centuries. The gift-giving Bishop Nicholas would probably be horrified by what he's become. Or maybe he'd be pleased that his spirit of generosity has touched billions of lives, even if the specific form has changed beyond all recognition. For those of you who are grandparents now, who have seen this tradition from every angle, first as believing children, then as Santa-performing parents, now as grandparents watching the cycle repeat, you understand the full arc. You know the magic is manufactured, but you also know the magic is real. The contradiction doesn't trouble you. You've made peace with it. You've watched children's eyes light up on Christmas morning. You've seen genuine joy at opened presents. You've felt the satisfaction of giving anonymously, letting Santa take the credit. You've participated in maintaining a beautiful lie in service of creating genuine happiness. That's what Santa Claus is, finally. A beautiful, complicated, commercial, generous, fictional, powerful, evolving, enduring beautiful lie that we tell together because it makes the world slightly better, if only for one morning a year. The real gift isn't the toys under the tree. It's the tradition itself, passed down, adapted, maintained across generations. It's the story we tell together, the ritual we perform, the magic we choose to believe in even knowing it's not real. Saint Nicholas of Myra gave secretly to those in need. 1,700 years later, millions of people do the same thing every December, maintaining the fiction of Santa Claus so children can experience wonder. The specific form has changed beyond all recognition, but the spirit, generosity, anonymity, creating joy for others, that's continuous across the centuries. Maybe that's what endures, not the red suit or the flying reindeer or the North Pole workshop. Those are just the current costume the myth wears. What endures is the human impulse to give, to create magic, to make others happy, to pass on traditions that connect us to the past and the future simultaneously. Tonight, whether you believe in Santa Claus or see him as commercial manipulation, whether you embrace the tradition or reject it, whether you have fond memories or complicated feelings, the story itself is worth knowing. Because it's not just Santa's story, it's ours. It's how we've chosen to celebrate, how we've commercialized and spiritualized and mythologized one of our most important holidays. From a Turkish bishop to a global icon, from secret charity to commercial empire, from religious saint to secular symbol, the journey has been long, strange, contradictory, and absolutely fascinating. And it's not over. Santa Claus will continue to evolve, to adapt, to serve whatever purposes future generations need him to serve. The myth is alive, and living myths change. So as you drift off tonight, consider this. Somewhere right now, a child is writing a letter to Santa. Somewhere, parents are hiding gifts and eating cookies left out for a fictional visitor. Somewhere, people are perpetuating this elaborate fiction in the name of creating joy. That's humanity at its best and worst, its most commercial and most generous, its most cynical and most believing. That's Christmas. That's Santa Claus. That's us. Sleep well. And in the silence of history across 17 centuries, Nicholas of Myra might smile at what his simple generosity became. Or maybe he's already forgotten, transformed so completely into something else that the connection barely exists. Either way, the gift continues. The story endures. The magic persists. And tomorrow morning, somewhere, a child will wake up believing in miracles. That's enough.